Welcome to the Oncology Podcast. If you enjoy today's edition and would like to subscribe, head over to oncologynews.com.au and subscribe to our newsletter for regular podcast updates and a weekly review of the oncology news from Australia and around the world.
Hello. In today's edition of the Oncology Podcast, I'm chatting with Dr Michelle McDonald from the Garvan Institute about her research on bone metastasis. Michelle has been involved in research projects for 13 years and is currently the group leader of the Bone Microenvironment Group at the Bone Biology Lab at the Garvan. Hi Michelle, thank you for joining me today to discuss your work on preventing metastatic bone cancer. I'd like to start by asking you how you found yourself at the Garvan working in bone cancer research.
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for having me today. So I started my career coming up to almost 20 years ago, actually. I started at the Kids Hospital at Westmead, and I worked there for 10 years, during which I did my PhD in bone repair and in bone biology. And towards the end of my PhD, I unfortunately lost my grandmother to breast cancer, which metastasized to her bones. And that really drove my desire to move my research career into that area. So a few years later, I saw an opportunity to do that and to move institutes and come over to the Garvan back in 2012 when Professor Peter Croucher, who's really a world-renowned bone cancer expert, came across from the UK to start a new lab here. And I was one of the first people he recruited, so I was really lucky to jump at that opportunity and come and work for Peter at the time. And to move my career into working on bone cancer specifically. And I've had his support and guidance for the past 8 years here towards developing my own independent research team here at Garvan now. So I work with Peter as a mentor rather than for him now, which I've been very lucky to make that transition under his guidance.
Oh, it's fantastic to have had that support and to be able to pursue something that's important to you personally as well as professionally. Perhaps for the broader audience, you could briefly explain why it is so important that we tackle metastatic bone cancers.
Sure. Well, as I'm sure many people know, a large number of cancers unfortunately do target the skeleton when they metastasize. Two of the cancers that really we see a high level of this metastatic growth in bone are breast cancer and prostate cancer. And when these cancers, as well as others, but primarily these cancers target bone, we see a really dramatic drop in quality of life in patients. They have a lot of pain and discomfort. The cancers then become really difficult to treat in bone. They're largely incurable when they reach this site. And unfortunately, they also then spread quite rapidly. They can spread to other bone sites and also to other soft tissues to cause more issues such as lung, liver, and brain. And ultimately, all of this together leads to quite a dramatic drop in survival rates. So this is really why I see and the field see it's important that we tackle metastatic bone cancer, because it has such a poor survival rate, really, is what it comes down to.
Absolutely. And why is it so difficult to treat?
Well, I guess the skeleton is really a large organ. There are a lot of sites in bone that the cancer can spread to. They don't know why it spreads to certain parts of the bone. But once it gets into bone, it can grow really quite rapidly. But what's also an issue is when the cancer spreads to bone and it hasn't really started to grow yet, and it's just a small cancer, it's undetectable. There's no symptoms. So often these cancers that target bone, these metastatic growths are diagnosed quite late and advanced. And because they're later, they are then harder to treat. We also know that cancers, when they're growing in bone, they can develop a chemo resistance or resistance to treatment, and therefore recurrence of disease becomes much higher. So really the odds are against people when we have this treatment in these cancers targeting bone. Because of these reasons, they're resistant to treatment, recurrence is high, they spread rapidly. But one last area is that we're starting to discover now that the tumour cells can lay in a dormant state in bone. And that's what we've been focusing our work on, because we know that this dormancy is what leads to likely this chemo resistance and recurrence rate. So that's why we feel that the bone metastases are hard to treat.
Okay, thank you. You recently received Cancer Council grant funding for your latest research project. Congratulations. But before we look at that, I'd like to explore your previous project in which you pioneered an intravital imaging technique to watch single cancer cells in living bone. Can you tell us more about this fascinating work?
Sure. So this was work my team and I developed with Peter Croucher as well, and some other key researchers here who are experts in imaging. And we developed a novel platform which, as you said, allows us to look at single tumor cells living inside bone tissue. And these bone tissue is completely intact and alive. So that's allowed us to localize where these cancer cells live in bone. But what it's also allowed us to do is show that they can acquire this dormant state, which is what I referred to earlier, this state where they become in a sleep like state. They're dormant, they're not growing, and they can be chemoresistant. What we've been able to do using this technique is localize where they sit in this dormant state, but then importantly, watch what happens to them over time and track them becoming activated to form these aggressively growing tumors. So, really, this pioneering technique allowed us for the first time to visualize this process in real time. And that's something that the field had never been able to see before. And with static approaches and the approaches that we had to look at this process before, we were making a lot of assumptions. Whereas now we're seeing it in real time inside living tissue. And it's really helped change the direction of the field in how we understand this process of tumor cells arriving in bone, becoming dormant, staying there and surviving in a dormant state, but then being switched on to grow and form these destructive tumors.
Yes, really fascinating. Thank you. Now, onto your current project. The first aim is to demonstrate that tumor initiation can be prevented. Can we explore this in some more detail?
Sure. So as I mentioned, now we can visualize how these cells are arriving in bone and how they become dormant and how they're activated. What we've learned is that the cells that live in the bone microenvironment that the tumor cells engage with when they get there are really playing a key role in this process. So what we're now looking to do is exploit that interaction between tumor cells and bone cells to really see if we can stop this initiation event. So what we see is that their tumor cells arrive in bone and sit in a niche in bone, which are cells that provide a support for their dormant state and lets them sit in that dormant state where they can survive a long time. And they can actually also escape the immune system by being in this dormant state and, as I mentioned earlier, resist chemotherapy. What we've also recently shown using our imaging technique is that these bone resorbing cells, the osteoclasts, these cells usually resorb and eat away at the bone tissue normally to replace it when it's needed. But what we've shown is that the dormant tumor cells interact with these osteoclasts. And what we've seen is osteoclasts can actually release them from dormancy and initiate their growth. So now that we know that osteoclasts, these local bone cells, are playing a key role, we're now looking at whether we can stop this from happening by blocking the activity of those osteoclasts and therefore stopping waking up the dormant tumor cells and therefore preventing the initiation of the tumors in the first place.
Yes, that certainly would be the ideal solution. What an incredible outcome. Another element of your current project is investigating methods to prevent recurrence. Can you share some details on this?
Sure. So, if we can stop cells from waking up and keep them dormant, essentially people will be living with their tumors asleep. As I mentioned, they're chemo-resistant, and unfortunately, we don't always detect in patients that early initiation event because we don't know those sleeping dormant tumor cells are even in bone. We have no way of detecting them in humans. But at the moment, we do know that patients have chemotherapy treatment. They can go into a phase of remission, but they can have disease recurrence, which is when the tumor starts to grow in bone again. And they'll have another site that starts to grow. And we feel that's a dormant tumor cell that's been activated. So in that case, there, we know, sure, they've already had one bone cancer, but we may be able to stop the next episode or the recurrence of disease through, again, targeting this interaction. So we're now looking at modeling this by giving chemotherapy, inducing a remission in our models, then coming in with agents that stop those osteoclasts from working and possibly stop those recurrence events where those osteoclasts would come along and wake up those dormant tumor cells. And that'll allow us to possibly look at using these approaches in the clinic where we know someone's at high risk of disease recurrence by coming with these agents and stopping those dormant tumor cells being woken up.
Yes, fantastic. And that brings me very nicely to discussing the agents. We know denosumab and anti-resorptive treatments are common adjuvant therapies. What do you hope to demonstrate in relation to this and how that might affect treatment outcomes?
Sure. So these agents, anti-resorptives, as you mentioned, they are both aimed to block osteoclasts. They work in different ways, but both there's agents denosumab plus another group of agents called bisphosphonates that have been used for many years in the treatment of osteoporosis, but as you mentioned, are also used as an adjuvant treatment in patients with bone metastatic disease. And their main role and why they're used in the clinic in these patients is to try and stop the destruction that occurs when a cancer does target bone. But what we're looking at is how these agents may also be able to prevent disease recurrence or maybe even prevent the initiation in the first place, because we know how these agents work. We know they block osteoclast activity. So, what is really exciting about this concept is that there is actually clinical data with bisphosphonates, that other group of agents, not denosumab, that does suggest that cohorts of patients that have breast cancer actually have a decreased risk of disease recurrence if they're treated with a bisphosphonate. So, we know in the clinic there is data that does support our theory that these agents could be used to prevent disease recurrence in patients. But more importantly, we may even be able to look at how these agents can be used to prevent the initiation of the disease in the first place. And if we can stop that initial activation event in bone before the bone cancer kicks off, we may have even better clinical outcomes for patients. One other thing that we're looking at and we're hoping to demonstrate in relation to denosumab in particular is that recently we're seeing a lot of clinical data arising that suggests when patients come off denosumab, we're seeing a rapid rebound in bone loss and an increased risk of fracture in patients with osteoporosis. We know now through work that my group has done, as well as others, that this is because we're seeing when the agent's taken away, for a number of reasons, patients go off drugs, particularly patients with cancer, that we're seeing a really rapid increase in osteoclast activity. And that's what's causing the bone loss and the fracture in patients with osteoporosis. And that's something that needs to be addressed in that cohort of patients. But in the context of patients with cancer, as denosumab's being more and more commonly prescribed instead of the bisphosphonates in patients with bone cancer, if for some reason the patients have to come off the denosumab, they're likely to have a rebound increase in bone resorption and increased osteoclast activity. And if our theory that osteoclasts are waking up dormant tumor cells is indeed true, we're really looking at having an increase in disease recurrence in these patients. Their risk of disease recurrence may actually go up. So that's something that we're looking to model as well in the lab so that we can provide the evidence to suggest there could be a danger for patients coming off denosumab who have metastatic bone cancers, to inform the clinicians that these patients could be at risk.
Yeah, that's such important work. It really does seem to me that your research could quickly have a direct impact on patient treatment strategies. Is it important to you that your research has clinically translatable outcomes?
Look, I think every scientist would like to see their work translate to improving patient health. But for me in particular, having worked for an orthopedic surgeon from day one of my research career, almost 18 years ago now, I have been educated by clinicians for the first 10 years of my career, and I loved seeing the capacity of my work to translate straight to helping, in that case, children in the clinic. So I was very much educated and trained by somebody who was asking very key clinical questions and then modeling that in the lab. And having had that exposure early on in my career has really driven that passion for me. I'm passionate in helping people no matter how and how long it takes to help people, but to see that translational shift and that the translation of my work to the clinic rapidly is really important to me. I'd like to see my work impact people as soon as possible. And by doing the sort of work I do, we're looking at treatments that are currently already in use and looking at clinical questions around those treatments, I can see that there's a possibility that my work will have translational outcomes really quite rapidly, which is really exciting.
It's really exciting, yes, and I can appreciate your passion. It's an incredible work that could have such potential impact on patients really quickly, as you say, which is not always the case with research projects. So congratulations, it's a really fascinating work. You co-chaired the International Bone and Mineral Society Young Investigators Committee for 2 years. I'd like to ask you a bit more, it's another more personal question perhaps, a bit more about networking and supporting young investigators, because that seems quite important to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I see the young investigators as the future of research. I think they have brilliant ideas and new ways of thinking, which I think will really, really rapidly infiltrate and impact our industry. I think it's incredibly important to support them and to support them to feel that they have a voice. I think that the reason I support them so much is because I can see how challenging our industry is becoming to survive in. Having success in funding in the time that I've been in this industry has really dramatically dropped. The success rates have dropped from government funding, which were about 20 to 25% back when I started, and they're down below 10% already in the space of my career, and I'm still transitioning to running my own group. So supporting their growth and their personal and I guess to some extent, career coaching them is really important to me because I see the challenges that lie ahead of them. And I'd like to help them learn from my mistakes, I guess, and how I've navigated to get where I am today and see that they can succeed in funding and succeed in reaching their career goals as best they can so they can focus on the science. So I am very passionate about supporting them. I do every opportunity that comes up to mentor, to guide, to speak at an event, to encourage and support young investigators. I do my best to do so because they are the future of what we do, and it's a difficult industry, particularly at the moment. I hope to see them succeed, and I hope things get a little easier for them.
Yes, we all do, and I think it's really important to raise that out, how much difficult it is for younger investigators. And as you said, even in the trajectory of your career, there are researchers that have been working for 30, 40 years, but even in the short space of time where you've transitioned into bone cancer, to have experienced such a drop in funding. And yeah, it's challenging. So I guess any support that we can all give is a valuable thing to do.
Absolutely.
Are there any resources you'd like to mention to our listeners who might have further interest in this area?
Sure. Look, I think if you jump on the Garvan website, I'm a little biased there, but I think this is a brilliant institute. I've really enjoyed my time here. I think the work that we're doing here is cutting edge, and there's an awful lot of great research going on here at Garvan, particularly in the cancer area. There's a huge cancer division here, and I'm very lucky to be doing my research amongst people here. So the Garvan website has some brilliant ideas and a lot of new approaches to communicating the sort of work that we do here. I find surprisingly, when I was encouraged to get onto Twitter, I was a little concerned. I'm a little shy with social media, but I've really learned how to use it as a resource for the work that I do, for profile building, for networking, surprisingly as well. I found it a great tool to really get in touch, particularly with international collaborators, and keep in touch with all of the cutting edge work that's on out there. There's a lot of scientists and journals promoting their papers through Twitter. So it may not be what you would expect to hear, but I think Twitter's a great tool for people in this industry. For anyone locally who's listening to this podcast, particularly females, there is a society. So this isn't necessarily about the work that I do, but in the industry. There's a society called Franklin Women, and this is a society that really they aim to provide an avenue for a number of things that support women in the medical and health sector. So it doesn't have to be scientific research necessarily. They provide mentoring programs, career coaching, networking events, and it's a really great avenue for networking and seeing how other women are navigating this industry. And I found it an incredibly useful society to be a part of. I've done a mentoring program through that, and I highly recommend people to get on board with that. Women, obviously, because it is a difficult industry that women, clinical or preclinical, you're faced with challenges. It can be somewhat male dominated. So I've found that that's been a great avenue for me for developing my independence in this stage of my career. So I recommend people have a look into that as well.
Oh, those are really helpful tips. Thank you very much for sharing. We will include links to the Garvan and to Franklin Women in the notes. And encourage everyone to check that out. That sounds like a really good resource. So thank you very much for sharing. And yes, thank you so much for your very valuable time and for sharing your fascinating work with us. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with healthcare professionals working in cancer care?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And I think everybody out there who's involved with supporting cancer patients in the healthcare industry, you all know that your role is incredibly important. And I'd like to thank you for all you do, those that are directly impacting and directly caring for cancer patients. What you do is incredibly important. So keep up the good work. And those of you in the clinic who have the time, I know you're busy people, but if you can, do your best to interact with those scientists that are at the bench and keep listening to us, engaging with us, networking with us, because we need to hear the questions, the real challenges that you have in the clinic to really do the best science we can to have maximal impact. So engage with us, do your best to interact with those at the bench, because we need to know what we need to do to help you better. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the supporter bodies like Cancer Council New South Wales. They, although not healthcare professionals, they're incredible supporters of patients with cancer. They've got some amazing supporters, donors, and friends that have really supported my work for a number of years now. And without the support of Cancer Council New South Wales and those that are behind them, the discoveries that we've made and hope to continue to make wouldn't be possible. So I'd like to thank them also.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much, Michelle.
You've been listening to the Oncology Podcast. If you enjoyed today's edition and would like to subscribe, head over to our website, oncologynews.com.au, and subscribe to our newsletter for weekly podcast updates and a review of the oncology news from Australia and around the world. Thank you for listening.